everyone. You see the screen. You see that it's not, 17 feet wide. You may want to come a little closer. You may or may not be able to see everything. I can tell you I snuck a sneak peek. I wasn't supposed to, but I did anyway. And you'll probably want to see some of the things that are on the screen. So I just invite you to come a little closer, and there's still plenty of room to spread out.
Real casual talk.
Yeah, real casual. So I don't remember the first time I had seen an article of the sort, but I remember being incredibly fascinated by the medical aspect of crucifixion. And a couple months ago, Dr. McDaniel, who's a parishioner and friend of the parish, along with his family, his wife's here, Jana, not the audience as well, but two daughters as well, and great gift to us. But he just mentioned, hey, I do this thing. And I said, hey, that would be awesome, right? And so we're just glad to have you, Matt. And
thank you.
Appreciate you being here. And, it's the sort of thing that it's a beautiful moment of mixing a passion for medicine and a passion for faith. And so we're just grateful for you blending those two worlds for us here today. So thank you.
Thank you. It's not that good of a talk, you guys. So normally I have given this talk to church groups, but I have also, the focus of this talk is to medical students and surgical residents. Before we get to the slides, I just want to go over, I don't know how much you all know about how trauma medicine is organized in the United States, and it will make some sense when we go through the slides. But trauma medicine in the United States is the same in Ohio as it is in Indiana, as it is in Florida, California, and it's set up by the American College of Surgeons, and it's very scientific. And what it is designed to do is to funnel the sickest, most grievously injured trauma patients to a level 1 trauma hospital. So, for example, Medina is probably a level 3. Southwest might be a level 2, but the main trauma hospitals around our area are Metro and St. Vincent Charity. And so the system is such that in bad weather, a person is transported by squad with Jesus's injuries to Medina, but then is somehow quickly transferred to Metro or to St. Vincent's, a level 1 trauma center. The reason for that is smaller hospitals don't have the level of care. So the main thing in medicine is do the best thing for the patient, and the best thing for the patient is to get them to the highest level of care. So a level 1 trauma center typically has all specialties in-house, meaning neurosurgery, cardiothoracic surgery, trauma surgery, every specialty that you can imagine for a trauma patient is in-house. And again, as we go through the slides to kind of drive home what exactly happened to Christ, the traumatic injuries that he sustained, I just want you to think in modern terms. If he had lived, he would have been taken off the cross, put in a helicopter, and flown to Metro or St. Vincent's and undergone a trauma evaluation. So those are the significance of his injuries. Before we start, Father said it was okay that I wouldn't get struck by lightning here close to the altar, so I'm big on St. Ignatius, and St. Ignatius used visualizations sometimes when he prayed. So I would like everybody to please just stand up and get in a position of comfort, just arms to the side, and I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to just start taking some deep breaths. Excuse me. And what I want you to visualize is you're in Jerusalem, the day of the crucifixion. And I want you to visualize the smells, the temperature, the blowing sand, the crowds, the architecture, the unpaved streets, probably the general energy that was in Jerusalem around that time, considering the importance of what is about to happen. Okay. Thank you. All right. The other thing we're going to talk about, my slides are a general guideline, outline. I'm going to kind of go off track, but we have to understand the mystery of why did Jesus do this for us? So, coming from Stations of the Cross, this is an ideal time to think through that. The other thing as we work through the medicine is, remember Jesus was fully man, so everything that happened to him, he felt just like you would, okay? And then finally, the last slide will be a very beautiful slide from one of our saints about the appreciation of what he endured that day. So the history of crucifixion, it's very well studied, which is sort of sickening, but it is very well studied. It's thought to have originated in Persia and perfected by the Roman Empire, and it was specifically used by the Romans as they expanded their empire to show absolute power over what Roman culture thought were inferior people. Typically, captured people in the men and other men, women, and children, as we'll see, in territories that the Romans conquered, slaves, and then later Christians. So I like history, and I will give you just one example of how brutal that could be. That if a slave in a household, in a Roman household, injured or killed his or her master, that slave and every slave in the household was publicly crucified, just as a show of power. It carried great weight with the Roman citizens. We've all heard of Cicero. I just kind of plagiarized these slides. It is a crime to put a Roman citizen in chains, an enormity to flog one, sheer murder to slay one. What then shall I say of crucifixion? It is impossible to find the word for such an abomination. So the Roman culture, if you think about that for a minute, I just want you to understand where they thought of themselves and where they thought of people like Jesus. It also extends to the Jewish culture, and it has Old Testament references. Undoubtedly, Jesus knew that. But the gist of this slide is that if you're hanged on a tree, you are accursed and abandoned by God. And so that explains a lot of the different passages in the New Testament where people that passed Jesus crucified, what they said, how they mocked him, and things like that. He literally knew that he was going to become a symbol that was abandoned by God. Always crucifixions were outside the city walls, because to be crucified was an abomination to the Jewish culture. So again, literally, this is a summation. God had abandoned the person hanging on the tree. Back to Cicero. So to get you to understand what the Romans would have thought of Jesus, Cicero made his name. He was a lawyer, and he made his bones. He argued a case of Gaius Verus. Gaius Verus was a former governor of Sicily, and he is literally thought, he was defended by Cicero. He is literally thought to have been the only upstanding Roman citizen that was ever crucified by Rome. Okay? The sheer numbers of people that were crucified, so we've all heard of Spartacus and what happened to him. We've all probably seen the movie or read. But 6,000 prisoners, 17-mile stretch along the Appian Way. So the Appian Way was the main road into Rome. It was very symbolic. Emperors coming back from Britannia or Gaul or any other conquest, it was a big deal to come down the Appian Way. But if you can imagine 17 miles on either side, people were crucified, men, women, and children. Getting closer to what we're going to talk about, when the Romans came into Jerusalem in 70 AD, before they destroyed it, it was Hadrian, for history buffs. He basically took Jerusalem and the temple to the ground. 500 people a day were crucified. So these things are they're historically documented. The one thing on here I'm going to put in this slide, this talk, the next time I get it or give it, I just have to find the reference. But when Pompey was in competition with Julius Caesar, when they were the triumvirate, he had gone up into what is modern-day Czechoslovakia, and he had put down a rebellion. And apparently, that 17 miles turned into 80 miles on either side of the Appian Way of people that he brought back to show his power. He stayed back in his army, the camp, with all these people, and then they were systemically crucified for it's thought to be 80 miles on either side of the Appian Way. Can you believe that? That would be like, what, here to almost to Columbus on either side. People every 12 stadia, so every almost 12 feet on either side, people were crucified. Getting to Jesus and the physiology. So in trauma medicine, we're taught what is the patient's physiologic reserve. So when you're 20 and you're healthy, you have a lot of reserve, meaning you have a lot of plasma volume, blood volume, your heart's in good condition, your lungs are in good condition, your belly organs are in good condition. So you have a lot of reserve. Well, what they deliberately did with Jesus and other crucifixion victims is they wanted to start him with no physiologic reserve. And that's why the Sanhedrin took him and kept him overnight. And we all know those passages. Undoubtedly, they didn't feed him. They didn't give him water. He started this journey of the stations, as you saw tonight, with no physiologic reserve. So he was what we call dry. He had limited blood volume. He was hungry, so his blood glucose levels were not optimized. I always think about, as I put this slide together and review it before I give a talk, is again back to the fully man. Can you imagine? He knew exactly what was going to happen to him. Not only because he had probably witnessed that as a little kid growing up, he had undoubtedly seen people crucified, but on a deeper level, he knew exactly what was going to happen to him. And that has always really resonated with me. So when he was flogged, this is a lot more brutal than probably you envision. This was, again, the Romans were so precise. It was designed to cause a lot of tissue trauma. Most people died during flogging, which the next slide you'll see. But the actual flog was specific. It was it was very long, multiple leather strips, and it had lead balls at the end of it. And those balls were designed to just flay a person's back. and just completely shred it. And if you can read the last paragraph there, skin, muscle, and fascia, the back would be hanging in ribbons when it was determined by the centurion in charge, and those centurions were around Christ this whole time. The prisoner was near death. The beating was finally stopped. Most people died during this. So this is a diagram that was taken out of a Roman history book from back in Roman history, and it literally was probably a manual of how best to do this to a person. And as we will see, the interesting part, the real medicine is, so we have severe tissue trauma. Many people died from it alone. Continued that physiologic cascade of no reserve. So he's getting weaker and weaker and weaker. He goes into shock, and it likely caused a hemothorax and a pericardial tamponade. And I have some slides about that. So this is what's called a hemothorax. This is a chest x-ray, and everything in x-rays is rotated. So this is the right. We're just taught this in medical school. This is the right, and this is the left. So here's the upper chest, here's the clavicles, here's your humerus, ribs. This is the heart. Well, all of this in here is blood and clear fluid. This is called a hemothorax, and that likely was caused from the trauma of that flogging. So the lining of the lung gets dislodged from the thoracic cavity, and there's just arterial and venous bleeding into the chest. So the other thing is a cardiac tamponade. So again, chest x-ray, here's the right, here's the left, here's the lungs. If you can see the outline of the heart, well, our heart has a membrane over it called the pericardium, but with severe enough trauma, these days it would be multiple gunshot wounds to the chest, you get fluid between the heart and that pericardium, and that's called a cardiac tamponade. So from the flogging forward through our stations, as he walked, as he carried, as he was crucified, he had these two conditions in his chest, and that's something else. You can't discount the thorns, so again, more bleeding. So the Romans had a very systematic way of doing that. The scalp is one of the most vascular areas of the body. So all those movies that you see are pictures with the blood running down the face, and we've all had kids that have, taken one in the head, and you got to go get them stitched up. How much they bleed? Well, so everything with this process was designed for maximum trauma to the person. So in this walk, the reason I put this in is this has also been studied. I heard the deacon talking about Simon. So what exactly made Simon, this person in the crowd, what made him help? From most Roman accounts, it would have been that the centurion in charge of this whole process, he probably had done 10 of these that day. He just wanted to get it over with. And so he saw that Christ, with those conditions, loss of physiologic reserve, just couldn't do it anymore. And it isn't, so 650 yards. So can you imagine walking with something that weighs 165 pounds on your back after you had been through everything that he had been through, with that blood and fluid in his chest, to go 650 yards. Also, Father can help me out, there's only one gospel that says that Simon helped him. Most gospels say he did the whole walk himself, and that's why I call it the walk. So, I bring up myrrh because I think it's notable. I've always been struck by he refused that. It was an ancient analgesic, probably a weak opioid, and he refused it. And in my mind, I have no proof of this, but this is, I guess, faith alone, is he did not want to blunt in any way exactly what was happening to him. He had fully taken this on as being fully man. But it is documented that it was refused by him. So back to the x-rays, what they would do is, so the person would be probably, chest would be about this high based on the studies of how the cross was put in the ground. And, just another aside, they crucified so many people that they just, again, the efficient Romans, they had holes already dug. So they didn't dig holes every time. They just tipped that cross in with the person on it. They're laying on the ground, nailed or tied to it, probably a combination of both, and then they would just tip it in because they didn't have time to dig another hole. We've all, used post-hole diggers. I grew up on a farm. It just wasn't time for that if you're doing 500 a day. So he would have been about here, his chest about here. So one of the centurions who would have been in charge of this to probably hasten the process would have taken one of their battle spears and just jammed it into his chest from the side. And so what comes out, the water and wine, makes sense to me, having stuck surgical instruments into people's chests, is it would have looked like water and wine. It would have been a combination of clear fluid and blood, and that's from that hemothorax and that pericardial tamponade. So, I forget why I think this was for another talk, a theme throughout his ministry. Oh yeah, no, it does, it's coming back to me. At Cana, and then even our Mass, the water and wine. So next time you partake, when we ever do get back to taking wine, is just think of the significance of that. Think of that spear being jammed into his chest. So, and what that really meant, and how real, from McDaniel telling you, from those x-rays and everything, that was. So somebody, Father and I were talking earlier today, somebody very smartly pointed out that, well, Jesus' legs weren't broken. And I have this in here, and that person was right. And there's an Old Testament reference, and he and I got interrupted, I forget what, but there's a reason why, if you remember, Pilate sends someone out, one of the soldiers out to break Jesus' legs. But his legs weren't broken because he was already dead. And there's an Old Testament reference to that that's escaping me now. Father can help me. But the reason I bring this up is to continue this theme of brutality. People, they lived a long time in being crucified. There are accounts of people living for 24, 36 hours hanging on that cross. And so, again, when the Romans got sick of it, or they needed another hole and it needed to crucify more people, they wanted to have that person die. So what they would do is they would go up, and again now, so legs are probably about here, and they would just take a heavy club and they would break their tibias. And when you break the tibia, then they lose, the crucified person would lose all support, and they would fairly slowly suffocate to death, because they wouldn't be able to prop themselves up against the nails that were through their feet. And that's how you lived, as you tried do this, because this position, you're just slowly suffocating, so you would, despite the pain, you would push yourself up on those spikes in your feet. So breaking the legs removed all that frame, that support, and then the person would suffocate. So. Yeah, so they weren't, he in particular, he did not have that, and that's a reference back to something in the Old Testament that I apologize, escapes me. Archaeologically, they have found things like this. And so this is a modern rendering of a spike, and then this is an archaeologic find. So there's debate as to whether people are only nailed or tied. More than likely, it was a combination of being nailed and tied to the cross. So even tied like this in this position, having lost all your reserve, as we talked about, and being up there for 24 to 36 hours, you just would have probably suffocated. The modern cross, I always look at the crosses when I'm in different churches, and I want to see the figures, but this is historically accurate. Our crucified Jesus up here. Sometimes you see it through the palm. That would have just, it would have just torn out. There's no structure there, just in the palm. He would have just fallen and torn right through the palm. Through the carpal bones would have provided more structure, so that is likely. Same thing through the feet. If it had been, here in the webbing of the foot, he just would have torn through. So being very efficient, the Romans knew that if they want to keep somebody on that cross, they're going to put it through the metatarsal bones right under the ankle joint. And that would have provided a lot of structure. And you wouldn't have just torn through. So, but that's what it would have been like to just hammer that spike in. The main nerve of the hand, by the way, is the median nerve, and it's right there. So it would have just transected that nerve, and that would have been agony. So in the final reflection, before I take any questions, if you have any, I hope you do. Catherine of Siena, patroness of Europe, a well-known mystic, 14th century? Yeah. Had a lot of visions. Christ was with her all the time. Literally, her visions were how cool is this? I mean, she sat down to eat, he sat down to eat with her, that kind of thing, across the table and sitting next to her and in physical contact with her. But I would just let you read that. So, any questions? What? Oh, okay, I'll read it. Okay. Catherine of Siena, reflecting on the crucifixion, said, quote, "Because of his hunger for our salvation and the honor of his Father, Christ humbled himself and gave himself up to a shameful death on the cross, mad with love, drunk, and lovingly desirous of us." So when I read that, and then I think everything that he went through, not just when he was nailed, but The anticipation of it, and still was willing to do it with mad with love, drunk and lovingly desirous of us. That carries a lot of weight with me and always has since I was a little kid. Okay. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I heard from an Eastern Rite priest one time that in the Eastern religions we see that little cross beam at the foot of the cross, and he said that that was like to keep Jesus's feet at a different angle, the legs at a different angle. Is there any medical background to it?
Well, the reason, switching out of Jesus and just the Roman intention of crucifixion, the show of absolute power in Cicero and Pompey and all those, it was they didn't want the people to die quick. They wanted them to suffer. And they wanted them to suffer as a public spectacle. And so anything that was done with the nailing or the probably nailing in combination with rope was they wanted them to live for a while and scream and suffer and have their families there and friends and all of that to make a point. So that would be my answer to that.
Can you speak a little bit to the position, and maybe this is actually part of the foot thing, I think, but medically, the ability to breathe when you're hanging like this.
You suffocate slowly.
Yeah, so like with the foot thing, I would imagine they wouldn't have wanted a straight flat one because that would be easy to stand up again, get your breath,
Yeah.
and then come down.
Right. So
This is just a thought. I'm not an expert on crucifixion or the medical part, but if it's at an angle, it's
Right.
a lot harder to get up and get your breath.
Right, so think of if you had to do an isometric squat and you had to hold it for 24, 36 hours. You're pushing up against a spike through your metatarsal bones. How difficult that would be, but humans have a unbelievable, well, I'll tell you something I probably shouldn't tell you. It's bad doctor humor, but when we're residents, we just say, thank God people are tough to kill. They really are. People are tough to kill. And so you will do everything you can to brace yourself and push up on that spike in your feet. Yeah. People don't give up, when I see people and I take care of people and they're 9mm gunshot wounds to the chest. They don't want to die. There's some spark within us. People survive unbelievable things. So you are not just going to give up. You are going to struggle to try to buy life, buy time. As hopeless as it probably felt in that era.
So how long was this whole process then before?
Well, you figure just in the recounting of it, the writing of it, it had to have been 12 hours because we know that at least it went from day to night, at least. So that's how long he suffered. And people suffered for, it's well documented. The Romans, 24, 36 hours people lived that way. That's why they had those measures to break their legs, beg your pardon, jam a spear in their side. They just wanted it. Okay, this is too long. We need to, get somebody else on that cross.
Okay, so you're saying a normal person being crucified, they took a healthy, some kind of healthy, and put them on the cross. They didn't go through the flogging and the treatment that Jesus did ahead of time.
They lived a long time, unfortunately.
They
Yeah, so that flaw, so if we go back, he's captured in the garden. He's put in a cell. Undoubtedly, there was a do you think that they gave him all the water and food he wanted to drink? No. He also, if you think of his lifestyle, he was chronically malnourished, right? Just his lifestyle. You know, he was a poor person in a poor society, and so, I mean, what's the only food we ever hear is bread and fish, right? So he started off likely a poor, think of next time you see a homeless person. That's how his physiology started off. So then you put that in a cell with the Sanhedrin, and they make him Peter's outside and all that. So there's, to your time, there's at least another 12 hours, right? It had to have been. It's pretty clear. With likely no food or water, so he's further down that physiologic cascade, we call it, of malnourished. In trauma, malnourished isn't as bad as not having volume, blood volume. People die nobody dies acutely of being malnourished. People die acutely of not having blood volume. Because if you don't have blood volume, you have no cardiac function. You can't perfuse your brain and your vital organs in your belly. So he started, so they just continued. He started off that way, and then they continued that. Then, now that I put my mind to it, the whole process was probably 2 or 3 days, because he didn't just immediately get an audience with Pilate. He probably had to wait. I mean, there were probably other people, right? And then there was the whole thing with the betting on his garments and all that. So that all would have had to have taken time. So then he gets flogged. And that flogging we saw, that isn't just getting smacked on the butt. That's tissue trauma, enough to cause conditions inside his chest cavity and close to his heart. So, yeah.
Matt, can I fill in a couple of the scripture things, and then I got a question myself? But to the timeline question, yeah, it's drug out, longer than a day for sure. But if we go to the Gospels, we can get some sort of sense that he was at the site of the crucifixion by 9 and dead by 3, right? So we've got that amount of time. His time on the cross alive was very short, relatively speaking, probably because he endured a lot more trauma beforehand, however long exactly that was. The other things you were talking about earlier, I'll just let you roll right through it, but the Old Testament references that pointed to none of his bones being broken.
That's it, right?
Psalm 34 is one place, but overall it goes back to the Passover and the unblemished lamb. And there's a few references in Deuteronomy and Numbers and Exodus that point to that. So ultimately, theologically, that's what it's about, regardless of where the reference came. And then the other piece was you mentioned Simon. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke refer to Simon, but John focuses a little bit more on the divinity of Jesus, and he leaves Simon out of it. So those are all the scripture pieces. But the thing I wanted to ask you, just for clarity, I've always been fascinated by Jesus being, pierced by the spear, right? So to be clear, you're saying if a normal healthy person gets thrust through the ribs with a spear, maybe there is blood and water that come out, but not gushing what would it be like if somebody threw a spear right through your
Just a little bit of blood, maybe a lot of blood, but not blood and water. The water was the hemothorax, and the pericardial tamponade. So if I just took my pocket knife right now and jammed it in here, there'd be some blood, but there would not be any water, any clear fluid. Our lung is completely, totally, our whole respiratory system is dependent on our lung being tightly adhered to the inside of our chest. how it's supposed to look, a clear lung. This is the diaphragm. This is all a well-inflated lung. And over here, we've got the heart is okay, but everything in here is also blood and fluid. So when a patient comes in like that, they've had a gunshot wound to the chest, or they've had significant blood trauma to the chest, and now we do just automatically run through a quick time CT, but the same thing is immediately we put a chest tube in there, and what comes out is blood and water. And we do that, it's an immediate life-saving maneuver because that person can't breathe, they're getting suffocated. And we have to relieve that pressure. That pneumothorax, that lung is non-functional. It's lost all its structure. It's just this floppy piece of tissue. It can't inflate, it can't expand. So we would put in a chest tube, and we would drain that, and we would that chest tube would be put to it's called a hemovac. It's a negative pressure machine. I don't know if anybody's ever in here's ever had a chest tube in, but if you ever had heart surgery or anything, you've had a chest tube in, and it immediately reinflates the lung and restores some structure to the lung. So it literally, that spear into this mess and that mess would have appeared to be blood and water. Like a lot. Maybe a gallon sometimes. It just would have come sometimes almost shooting out. Hemohydritis, there is a condition, people can sweat blood under duress. Oh yeah, think of this. He knew on every level exactly what was going to happen to him. Not only as a man in Roman-occupied Jerusalem, from childhood, he had witnessed crucifixions. They would just leave these people hanging up, again, as a spectacle, as a show of absolute power. The passage, what is it, Mark, where he's crucified next to the two convicts. I mean, that's just what they did for a reason. So not only did he have that sense of it, but he also, as God, he knew what was going to happen since the beginning of time. Exactly every second of it, what he was going to suffer. So I guess the analogy would be, I have a patient that in her old life, she was a death row nurse for the state of Ohio. She did that for like 10 years. So she has a little bit day to day what is going to happen. But can you imagine if that's you on all those levels? So I've always been struck by that part of it. This wasn't some abstract thing that, he just was grabbed and it was this big struggle. I mean, he knew since the beginning of time, he had preordained this and then had seen it over and over and over and over and over as part of the culture. Come on, I see questions. You might as well ask. Some bad doctor humor, but probably Father would. No, we just think that's,
What's your bad doctor?
No.
Are you sure?
No.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so just as you go home, especially since y'all did the Stations of the Cross, just think of if that happened now, Jesus, that patient, would be put in a helicopter and flown to Metro and undergone a full trauma evaluation. That's what they did to his body, his human body. Well, that's a good question. So here's how a trauma alert goes. You're in a level 1 trauma center. You're a physician there. You're on call. Your level 1 trauma centers, there's no on call. It's just 24/7. There's somebody there, all subspecialties. And so what happens is there's a trauma alert is activated, and it's like a hurricane alert, I guess. So these days it's all electronic. It used to be the squad guys would call us, but now it's all electronic. And so either in the field, EMS, or life flight lands at a scene. And the helicopter, boom, and I flew in them, boom, we landed at a scene, and it's a bad accident. Somebody's been ejected from a vehicle, and they're so the basics of resuscitation are A, B, C, D, and E. And A is airway. So you secure an airway. If they don't have an airway, they're going to die no matter what else is wrong with them. B is breathing. Are they breathing? So you secure an airway. Are you ventilating them? C is circulation. Do they have a blood pressure? So we're back to low blood volume. So do they have blood pressure? If they don't, they're going to die. They're not perfusing their brain or their vital organs. D, do they have a deficit, a neurologic deficit? But unless you sequentially do A and this guy comes in, he hits a trauma bay. There's a whole team there. We're gowned, scrubbed, sterile, full surgical kits around us. And what we would do is we would, as every member of the team, the trauma team assumes their role. Presumably, they have been intubated in the field, so they have an airway, a secure airway. They have an endotracheal tube. In a helicopter, believe it or not, those Sikorsky life flights, it's like a little intensive care unit. They have electronic ventilators. But if not, if it's a squad, the squad guys are squeeze in a bag, an in-blue bag, and they're ventilating. So we have an airway secured, we have B breathing, he's being ventilated. In the field, they would have had a couple of large bore IVs put in, or if they didn't, and in place like, I remember Jana knows when I rotated through St. Vincent's downtown, I mean, that would come in, that would walk in the front door, or it would get pitched off out of the car. That right there would. And so then it was up to us to get a couple of large bore IVs. So then we're pounding volume. Volume would either be bags of saline and type O blood. Would to restore volume so that if the heart's beating, it's got something to squeeze against and maintain a blood pressure. Then we would shoot a chest film, and we would see this. And so if I was attending, then I would quickly do a betadine scrub to sterilize that side of the chest. I would identify in between the ribs. I would make an incision, and I would stick, it's called a chest tube. It's about that big around, and it's perforated, hollow but with perforations, and I would jam this in here, and then I would get all that blood and serosanguinary blood and water would come out, and it would reinflate the lung, and I would stitch it in place, and one of the nurses a respiratory therapist actually would attach it to that negative pressure machine, and it would restore not 100% of that lung's function, but a lot of it. So now so that's still we're at ABC. We're still at breathing actually for that part of it, and then we would continue the evaluation. What else do they have? Do they have in clinical practice? This is like a pericardial tamponade. Since luckily people don't get flogged much these days, this is usually from a penetrating chest wound, a gunshot wound, or a stab wound. It injures the heart muscle, very vascular obviously, and the heart muscle just starts bleeding into the lining of the heart, and it just widens that out. And when that space gets too tight from that blood, the heart can't squeeze as hard. So usually by this time, if this were identified, we'd have a high suspicion of this if they came in with gunshot wound or penetrating injury to the chest. This is very, 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 very common. This is pretty unusual. If this were seen, depending on their hemodynamic status, I may try to drain this if they're going to die right there in the trauma bay and there's no other choice. But usually they're okay, and cardiothoracic surgery takes them upstairs to cardiothoracic operating room, and then they crack the chest and surgically repair this pericardial tamponade. It would just depend on what their status looked like in a trauma bay, because that's where you start out in a trauma bay, in a level 1 trauma center.
So fortunately for all of us,
regardless of if before the crucifixion he could have been saved, now, back then, if they had stopped him before the crucifixion, I mean, this wide open back, just filling with bacteria and whatever,
Yeah. But remember, people are tough to kill. So there are accounts of people surviving crucifixion for whatever reason. Oh, we were wrong. It wasn't you. We let you come down. I mean, that there are. Yeah, I'm sorry about your luck. Yeah, and people have survived crucifixion, but not what they deliberately put him through to cause these other conditions, which is kind of the focus of this talk. Yeah.
Matt, I think maybe we'll tie it up there. If you have other particular questions, maybe you got a few extra minutes. I do. Yeah. We wrap up here, but just want to thank you again for joining us here today, and again, sharing faith and medicine and those things together. If you had a hard time seeing the slides, Ed has informed me that they are pretty well visible on the live stream. So if you want to go back and look at them at home, you can see the slides and revisit the talk as well. So feel free to do that. But again, thank you, Matt, for joining us.
Make it bigger or something, so people, look at the slides, because I did put a lot of good information in there. Very moving with the Cicero and some of the numbers of how many people were crucified. And if I had known that, I would have just read through them, but I just assumed that people could see it.
Yeah, no worries. It's all good. Why don't we close in prayer? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Father, we praise you and thank you for your goodness and love, and your fidelity to us, most particularly demonstrated through the death of your Son on the cross. And, we ask you that, especially as we journey through this Lenten season, but throughout our lives, we may continually grow in appreciation, not just for what he went through, but that passionate love that he had for us, that he has for us, that continues to send him in pursuit of us, that would make him willing to go to his death on the cross, even as he agonized over it in the garden, knowing that what he would go through, that he loved us so much that he continued on that journey. So we thank you and praise you, and just ask you to bless all who are gathered here. Bless them for their openness of heart, their minds, their spirits, and their desire to know you and to love you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father,